Where is Aaron right now? You done messed up, Aaron!
Aaron is right here once again with Attorney Zac Morgan. How's it going, Zac?
I'm good, Aaron, and hopefully you and your viewers have had a relaxing weekend as we gear up to jump back up on the hamster wheel.
Absolutely. Well, this morning I went to Busch Gardens and went on a ton of roller coasters, so I had a relaxing start to my weekend, at least. By the way, is it really cold where you are?
No, we went into we call it going into town or into the city. We went into Oklahoma City today to do a few things, and I had sweatpants on and a short sleeve shirt, and I mean my young child was probably uncomfortable if she hadn't had a jacket on, but I was fine.
Nice. Okay, I just wondered if you were like being inundated with snow or anything like that. Okay, so what we want to talk about today is this relates to what I have started exposing. I guess it feels like it's just only the last week or two, and we're going to keep this PG or PG-13. We're gonna avoid the buzzwords YouTube doesn't want you to say. But I've been focusing on instances in Scientology where crimes are committed against children, and Scientology knows all about it. They investigate it thoroughly and they cover it up. And from the perspective of the country's and the state's legal system, they cover up these crimes. They silence the victims, and thereby protect the abusers and fail to protect society. So what we're talking about here is the subject of mandated reporters, mandatory reporting, what that means, who has to do it, when it applies. And I'll tell you the reason why I really wanted to talk about this with you. I did receive an email from a viewer who said she was an expert in the subject and that I had been discussing this subject incorrectly. That first of all, mandatory reporting or mandated reporting or whatever does not mean reporting to the criminal authorities. It means reporting to the civil authorities, particularly Child Protective Services. Maybe we can just start right there. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. So I've reviewed that email, and you and I had this conversation before we went live. For the most part, the viewer is about 85% correct. In the areas in which there's some inconsistencies or inaccuracies are not a big deal. Obviously, that individual had spent her sounds like the majority of her working career in this industry, and so the areas in which her knowledge exists is very, very good. There's just some things outside of her knowledge base that most people would assume that were like 80% correct or missing a few pieces or incomplete. So and the best way to start with this, and you actually asked me this before we went live, what is the difference? You hear these terms mandated reporting, mandatory reporting, sort of interchanged, and exactly what that means. And essentially, a person who is subject to the mandatory reporting laws is called a mandated reporter. So the mandated refers to the person, the mandatory refers to the duty the person has.
Okay. And if someone is a mandated reporter, does that really just mean they're supposed to file a report with Child Protective Services?
In every jurisdiction that has a mandated reporting statute, mandatory reporting statute, it means that they have to report to whoever the statute says they have to report to. Most states have a Child Protective Services, which is its own standalone government agency. Some do it at the state level, some do it county by county or city by city. It's all set up unique by state. But in Oklahoma, all of the ACS or APS Adult Protective Services, CPS Child Protective Services, vulnerable and endangered persons, all of those are handled through the Oklahoma Department of Human Services. So all of those various entities answer to the director of the Department of Human Services. They all fall under that agency.
So I don't personally have any experience with CPS, and it's hard for me to understand where CPS, a civil authority, would overlap with the police when you're talking about CPS and abuse, you're talking about things that almost inevitably would violate criminal statutes. How does this work?
So every law, for the most part, has a civil and a criminal sibling. So the basic law school example is theft. If I steal your things, then I can go to prison because I violated the public's safety by taking things that weren't mine. So I could be charged with theft. You could also sue me for the tort of conversion. I converted your property into my property. And you could sue me saying, give me my watch back, or if I've destroyed or sold or otherwise no longer have the watch, give me the value of my watch back in money. It would be a money damages award. The same is true when it pertains to children and vulnerable adults. And that is, you can violate a statute that is civil, or you can violate a statute that is criminal. And a lot of times the acts of criminal and civil violations maybe, or the criminal and the civil statutes that you're violating may be violated by the same act. So just because the mandatory reporting laws require a mandated reporter report to Child Protective Services or the whatever authority is listed in the statute, you could also be violating a criminal statute. And so go ahead.
Well, does CPS then have an obligation to involve the police, or is their job just to make sure things are handled civilly?
No. So the job of CPS is to act as an investigator. If I make a report to CPS, then the Child Protective Services folks have to conduct an investigation. If there's claims made, if they come in, like for example, in Oklahoma, DHS, when I say DHS, CPS, think of them interchangeably, that's just the entity we report to here. If I make a report, DHS will show up and conduct home inspections. If a child is removed from the home in the middle of the night and placed in foster care, that's done by CPS or DHS. But that doesn't also mean that doesn't inherently mean I'm not also going to face criminal charges. They may take my child away because I'm abusing them or neglecting them, or I don't have them in a safe home. But I may also get in trouble from the police for abusing them or neglecting them, because there's criminal statutes that also have to do with child abuse and neglect.
But how would the police find out about it?
So CPS will inform the police, and this is where some of the information in that email varied off of my experience. For example, I'm going to use the role of school teacher, because every school teacher in America is a mandated reporter. If a school teacher sees a child or with bruises, or a child who's having trouble walking because they maybe have injuries or are sore, or if a child comes up to a teacher and says, I don't want to go home, my mom beats me or my dad beats me, that teacher no longer has a choice. As the teacher, I'm not going to investigate that. I'm immediately going to follow the prescribed policy that the school district has, and that policy mirrors exactly what the state law says they should do. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to call CPS. I'm not going to at some point I will file the paperwork that is required and give it to my school principal, for example, but I'm not going to call them first. My first call is to CPS. My next call, under Oklahoma statute, it says that there was actually, the legislature cleaned the language up, but for a while there was actually some conflicting language. It says that I have to call CPS immediately, as soon as I have reason to believe or have been told. And then as soon as practical, then I have to notify law enforcement, my local police department, or whoever the local law enforcement agency is. I have to report both of those. Now, the CPS or the Department of Families or whatever in each jurisdiction will coordinate with local law enforcement. So, for example, they may do an investigation, hand it off to the police and say, hey, we think there's criminal wrongdoing. So the police may go get a search warrant. They may go get an arrest warrant, whatever. So there's a lot of different things involved in that. And so your viewer who talked about her role as CPS was 100% correct from the CPS side. But each state varies. And in Oklahoma, where I live, and one of the states in which I practice, we have to, mandated reporters have to both tell DHS and the police. So it's not just a single, our statutes require reporting to both.
Okay. Now that I think about it, the person who emailed me, well, she started by saying that I had spoken about the subject incorrectly, but now I'm realizing perhaps she was just referring to the fact that I kept saying they were supposed to report the matter to the police. And the fact is, just replace police with CPS, and everything I've said still stands.
Absolutely. And now where it gets tricky, is there are not always, but well, in every mandatory reporting situation, the statute, when I say statute, so statutes, and I take for granted that your viewers know what these are. You've got pretty intellectual viewers, so if I'm pandering a little bit, I ask them to forgive me. Statutes are laws passed by legislatures. So the General Assembly, the House of Representatives, or the Senate signed by the governor. Or Congress at the national level, passed by the House and the Senate, signed by the president. Regulations are rules developed by agencies. So, for example, the legislature says we create the Department of Human Services to oversee the welfare of children and vulnerable adults, and they're going to write the rules necessary to do that. And then DHS says, here's a mandatory, here's how to report, here's how an investigation goes. These are the various titles and people that you ask questions to or answer questions from. But every statute that creates a mandatory reporting law also details, both by example, like job title, and by role, who a mandated reporter is.
Mm. So, okay, if the main point of my videos on this subject and the things that I've said on this subject isn't who should have been informed of the abuse, but simply that it was never done, then the viewer who sent me the email, her point completely stands. And yet my accusation against Scientology or Scientologists also stands. So if I'm saying, well, they should have informed the police and they didn't. Okay, fine. What I really should have said is, well, they should have informed CPS and they didn't. And maybe CPS informs the police, maybe they don't. But the omission still stands.
Yeah, the failure to report is still a failure to report, no matter what the statute says. No matter what the statute says about who you're supposed to report to, which governmental entity you're supposed to report to.
Right.
And the reason I say the law makes a difference, specifically outlines who a mandated reporter is significant, because everybody who lives and walks on this planet, certainly in this country, but also on this planet, has a moral obligation to report things that you think are wrong. If you see your neighbor beating the snot out of their kid, you have a moral obligation to tell somebody, but you don't have a legal one.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a school teacher, or you work, say at a nonprofit who deals with family and children, or you are a pastor, or you are a law enforcement officer, or you are a medical provider, or you are a therapist, those are all mandated reporters.
Right. Now, if you recall, the email also said that you only are a mandated reporter in instances where someone has committed the abuse against their own child, not another child. I found that very hard to believe.
Now, that may very well be true in her jurisdiction. And this is why there's some of this I can't conclusively say, yes, she's right or wrong. I can tell whether that individual is correct in the jurisdictions in which I practice. And every state has a mandatory reporting statute and defines mandated reporter, but each state does it a little bit differently. The way we do it in Oklahoma and in Colorado may be different than the way they do it in New Jersey and in Minnesota. I don't know. So that may very well be true in her jurisdiction. In my jurisdiction, a teacher, a pastor, a therapist, and a doctor are all examples of mandated reporters. So I have a child. If I take my child to the pediatrician and that pediatrician sees signs or symptoms of abuse or neglect, that pediatrician must, by law, make a report to DHS. But obviously my child is not that pediatrician's child, because my spouse is not also my child's pediatrician. Okay. Same thing with it. For example, if you go into therapy sessions, a therapist will tell you, hey, anything you tell me will stay in the strictest confidence of the therapist client or therapist patient privilege, except. And it's really two major exceptions. And the therapists out there, if I miss one, forgive me, but these are general rules. I'm not talking jurisdictionally specific here. One is, if you tell me of sufficient information that you are going to commit serious bodily injury or death against another, or if I tell you that I have or know of a child or vulnerable person who has been abused or neglected. And they'll tell you that, hey, listen, you can tell me anything you want to, and I will help give you the therapy you need and the coping mechanism, these tools to help recover, comma. However, if you tell me things that fall into this category, I have to report those.
Right. So the email basically gave me the impression that what she was saying was that if you find out someone has hurt someone else's child, you don't have a legal obligation to report that to CPS. Only if you find out that someone has hurt their own child. Now, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, that sort of makes sense because CPS is not a criminal. They don't investigate criminal matters.
They can't charge you. The worst they can do is take your kid away.
So if CPS shows up to your house, they're showing up to your house to check on the welfare of your kid and whether they're going to take your kid away from you. If you have one person who hurt another kid, who they can't, there's no house for them to show up to take the kid away from because the abuse didn't happen in the home. That context sort of makes what she said make sense.
Yeah. If uncle down the street is accused of causing physical harm to his niece or nephew, but uncle doesn't live in the home, I can call CPS and they're going to go to my home or to the child's home and check on the child. The child's safe. The parents are safe. CPS, yeah, they can't go arrest uncle, but in that context, the escalation may be CPS says, hey, the parents are telling me, yeah, absolutely. Uncle gets all liquored up and comes down when the kids are in the yard and harasses them and throws them around and causes them bodily injury. CPS may, depending on the jurisdiction, have an obligation to refer that to criminal authorities who can then open an investigation into the uncle from a criminal perspective. But CPS can't take a child away from somebody that doesn't already have the child.
Exactly. Okay, interesting. So since her point was that mandated reporting laws are purely civil, not criminal, and CPS would only even get involved if it was abuse happening within the home, now everything she was saying makes sense. And so her point was also, this is not something that the authorities are ever going to be able to get Scientology on, because this is not the mandated reporting laws aren't of a criminal nature. And
so this is where she and I disagree.
Okay.
This point is where she and I disagree. For this reason. If the Church of Scientology is a religious organization, and it is for tax purposes, IRS has said you are a tax-free, nonprofit religious organization, those issues aside, the people, and you and I talked about this in one of our very first or second live streams we ever did, we talked about this. Those individuals who are pastors or ministers or the equivalent thereof in the church, whichever persons make that roll up, or consist who are in that role, they are by statute mandated reporters. So if they know that the church is working minors without pay 12 hours a day, if the church if that individual knows that the church is making these minors run around a pole, or is on the rehabilitation project force, although allegedly that doesn't exist anymore, or the whole, they are in some way not being cared for appropriately. That individual who's in that ministerial or priestly role must report that to CPS. So this is where your viewer and I disagree a little bit. And I don't know that we actually disagree fundamentally. I think maybe we're using synonyms that we don't know are synonyms. But the concept is correct. If there are certain people who do have a legal obligation to report neglect, abuse, or injury to children and vulnerable people. So vulnerable people in most jurisdictions include the elderly and people of diminished capacity or mental retardation. So people who can't live on their own. Maybe they have severe learning disabilities, severe physical disabilities, and are generally dependent upon another person for their safety and health.
Right. So then, to get very specific, the original reason I started bringing this up is because I became aware and have done a few videos now about a Scientology staff member named Johnny Maurer, who was on staff in the Church of Scientology of Sacramento. And Scientology sent him around to a whole bunch of other churches of Scientology in the Western United States. And in the process of doing that, he abused in an adult nature, committed abuse of an adult nature against at least 5 underage female Scientology staff members. Now, we know that once Scientology caught wind of this, they did also verify that this abuse occurred with the minors themselves, which means there would have been an incident, a conversation, a meeting where the minor says, yes, this happened to me. So at that point, I guess it's up for question. Does somebody become a mandated reporter?
Yeah. As soon as the church or their respective persons found out about it, that became a mandatory report. Assuming
Even
the
though the
person found
abuse
out
didn't occur in the home.
it doesn't matter. There's no difference if I go in to confess to confession at the local Catholic church and I tell my priest about it. That's different. But and the reason I know it's the same, if anybody who's interested, you could just Google Spotlight, which was the Boston Archdiocese in the Catholic Church, and the horrible acts committed by many of their priests. I know we're speaking in code. The issue there is not that, well, obviously the issue is that the priest committed the act. That's a horrible thing. The bigger issue was the church knew about it. The church did not report it in accordance with the statute. The church covered it up, and the church kept moving these priests around to different parishes. There was even one in Minnesota. It was also very prevalent in Minnesota for a while, and there was a priest up there who 2 or 3 different bishops and archbishops knew what he was doing and elected not to do anything about it. So they sent him allegedly to rehabilitate him at a church-based rehabilitation facility for offenders of his type. They then returned him to priestly ministry in a facility of retired priests. So he was still celebrating the Mass. He was still celebrating or saying Mass, celebrating the Eucharist, doing these things that are sacred sacraments in the church. Even though they knew of this wrongdoing, not only did they know of the wrongdoing, they never told any of the state or governmental officials that the wrongdoing occurred. And then when asked about it, they said, oh, we didn't know about it. And that literally shed light on the fact that there at that time in the Archdiocese of Minneapolis and St. Paul, there were the public records and then a secret set of records. And the secret set of records had it all.
Well, so the email from the viewer, who again, I want to be clear, was an expert in this field, at least in her jurisdiction, would have me believe, just according to just what I recall of the email, that because that abuse did not occur in the home by the parent, nobody in this equation actually legally became a mandated reporter. Is that how you understood her email?
Maybe. And obviously, 85% of it was correct. And I think the 15% that she and I disagree on is a little bit nuanced. And I would need to know if I knew more about the jurisdiction she was from and knew more about their specific laws. It is very possible in that jurisdiction that they have an antiquated reporting statute that only requires reporting for allegations believed to have occurred in the home or by a resident of the home. That it may be a very narrow statute. Most states have broadened that to increase both the number of mandated reporters and the types of things that they must report.
Right.
That's the way I read it. It doesn't inherently mean she's wrong. It just means that the general rule of how this is supposed to work across jurisdictions didn't necessarily square with what she said in her email. But I can also understand that, I also take the caveat of, and I say this, I should have said this maybe on our first interview, all the things that I talk about legally on this channel are general rules, unless I say in my jurisdiction or where I practice. These are just sort of general rules. Every state will have a version of this, but it may be a little bit more detailed. I'm just sort of talking 10,000 foot overview.
Right. And, even in something like the Spotlight situation, it might seem to on the surface that the laws involved and the exact statutes that were violated and the exact convictions were handed down on might seem obvious, but sometimes these things aren't so obvious. Sometimes, they're very, very nuanced. So even though I've seen Spotlight and I'm familiar with all that, I couldn't give you the exact thing. I couldn't even tell you who exactly was found guilty. Was it the priests? Was it the organization? Was it the mother organization? I couldn't even tell you
Yeah.
who was found
So
liable. I
that's
don't
the big.
know.
Yeah, so that's the big deal, and the spotlight is still sort of messy. There's still fallout from that, even though that started in the late '90s, early 2000s. The one that I'm more familiar with, because it's a lot more contemporaneous to my practicing of law, is the situation in Minneapolis, the Archdiocese of Minneapolis and St. Paul. When I say the Catholic Church, I mean the legal entity that is the archdiocese. So the business entity that runs the Catholic Church in that area paid I forget the exact total, several $100 million in settlements to these families. And then I think they even went through a period of bankruptcy where they were reorganizing the assets of the church.
Right.
Sold off some property, closed and consolidated some parishes, eliminated some. I mean, there was some significant financial fallout from that. And those depositions, for your viewers who may be interested, it's sort of boring unless you're a nerd like me and super into just listening to other lawyers depose people. But depositions of the actors, the people who were staff members of the Catholic Church, including a person who carries the title of Vicar General, which is a administrative position. It's the chief of staff to the bishop or archbishop. So he was an ordained priest. He was a full-time cleric. They took his deposition. They took the deposition of the legal advisor to the archbishop, not the attorney, but the legal advisor, because there's both canon law and civil law in cases like that. But and then some females who were on staff who said, I sent this email, here's a copy of the email I sent, they did nothing about it. So it's if your viewers find stuff like that interesting, those depositions are available on YouTube. They're several hours long, so you're going to need a couple of cups of coffee to get through it. But if you want to know some of the nuances, for example, the lawyer does a really good job of saying, what does this statute say? How do you interpret this statute? What do you believe your role is? Do you think you're a mandated reporter? Do you believe that this is a mandatory reporting situation? What would you have done? Do you think you were right or wrong? So the lawyer does a really good job of walking these clerics and these full-time religious people through the law and how it works. So if you find stuff like that, if your viewers find that interesting, they can go check some of that stuff out on YouTube.
Okay. So perhaps what I should take away from this email is just that I should probably just realize there's no point even trying to paint all of this with one brush. That because I was looking, I did a video where I was going through the statutes state by state, where it would say in which states are members of the clergy mandated reporters. And I said, bingo, auditors in Scientology are considered members of the clergy. Sea Org members are considered members of the clergy. And I was saying these become mandatory reporters. And I was saying they were supposed to report to law enforcement and they didn't. I should take away from the fact mandated reporter does not mean reporting to law enforcement. It means reporting to CPS.
Correct.
CPS may inform law enforcement. And it may be that in some jurisdictions, finding out that a child's been abused, but not by their parent, not in the home, may mean the mandatory reporter rules did not get triggered there, perhaps.
Absolutely. It's super jurisdictional specific. And then, so, the last example you gave, in some jurisdictions, I find out about it, but the abuse was not performed by a person of the household, a member of the household. If that statute exists, and it very well may, that would be a very narrow statute. In my jurisdictions, we have very broad statutes. So not only do I have to call CPS, I also have to call law enforcement. And the number of people that it applies to who are mandated reporters is a very large number of people. And it also means that the number of situations that constitute a mandatory report are greater as well, not just limited to the household. I know situations where a student, a 17-year-old high school girl, has gone to her teacher and said, my mom slaps me at the house. Well, the teacher's job is not to investigate that. Teacher calls CPS or DHS, whoever. They perform an investigation. Teacher also calls law enforcement. Law enforcement drives by the house. The whole story comes out, and it turns out that 17-year-old girl gets mad at her mama, like 17-year-old girls tend to do. She and mama got into it. Mama reached up, slapped her across the face, and said, you will not talk to me like that in this household. It's a particular style of parenting. doesn't rise to the level of abuse, doesn't rise to the level of civil liability or criminal culpability. And it's just one of those, mom and daughter were having at it, as it happens in every household full of teenage girls all across America every day. But the report still had to be made. Now, in my state as well, or in my jurisdictions as well, daycare workers of any kind are mandated reporters. So I had another situation. It's actually a case in which I'm involved, or was involved. The case is closed now. But an individual came who worked at a daycare and said, I saw an employee of this particular child care facility possibly abuse or injure another child or a child. So the calls were made, the reports were filed, all the cogs went into motion, and an investigation was undertaken. Lots of people were interviewed, and the outcome was the outcome. And those are public records. You can, for example, find out, has CPS or a child welfare call been made against the daycare. They're not going to tell you who made it and what the outcome was, but they can say that in the last year there were 10 reports made, or in the last 10 years there were 2 reports made. That it's hard to know exactly what to do with that data, because if it's a large child care facility that has 80 kids and 60 employees, 10 in a year may not be many. But if it's a home daycare that's got 3 kids and there's 10 in a year, that's a lot. So you've got to be a little bit careful with that data, because there's no context for it, but some of that is public record.
So it just occurred to me that I might have also been making another assumption that is not correct. So I've been assuming that because of things like Spotlight, you mentioned the Archdiocese in Minnesota, or in the Twin Cities, right?
Correct.
I've been sitting here assuming that because the Archdiocese itself was found liable instead of just individual members, that this somehow had to do with a violation of mandatory reporting laws. But it's just occurring to me, maybe it's not that simple at all. Maybe the mandatory reporting laws is not the thing the Archdiocese was found liable for. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, perhaps it's 6 other statutes, but not that one.
Right. So yeah, it very well could have been that one, or it could have been others.
Because otherwise, how do you hold the organization responsible if it's not relating to some responsibility that organization had to report?
Right. So and so, for example, I think it's in Minneapolis and St. Paul. There's a priest. He may be deceased now. Jerome Kern. It was Father Jerome Kern. He was deposed. I can't remember if he was criminally convicted or not, but was engaged in inappropriate activities dating all the way back to the 60s. When I saw his deposition, he was an old man in his 80s. I mean, this happened years and years and years ago. But he admitted what he did was wrong, and but things like that tend to show patterns of behavior in the cover-up. And it's sort of like Richard Nixon and Watergate. We have never been able to conclusively prove that Richard Nixon knew about Watergate before it happened. What we did prove is that he covered it up and didn't do what he should have done when he found out. Well, there's also 18 minutes of tape missing, but that may, the smoking gun tape, as it were. But that's sort of the same scenario. Even if we can't prove that they were directly involved in the wrongdoing, like they knew, for example, in real time that such acts were occurring, the bigger issue is, once they found out about the acts, they had an obligation to report it, and they didn't. So now they're involved in the cover-up.
Right. And not to just come full circle on it, but the question then becomes, did they have an obligation to report? So, and this is, just to say it out loud, here's the issue, the core issue here. A Scientology staff member in his late 20s abuses at least five underage female Scientology staff members. Scientology finds out about it. Scientology knows all about it. Scientology verifies all of it with the children themselves. People are becoming aware of this who are not members of the clergy. This is not priest-penitent privileged information. Third parties are finding out about this. Administrators are finding out about this. And I guess in my videos, I have said, I feel like I will continue to say, someone here has to have a legal obligation to report the abuse of the children. Someone has
absolutely.
to.
Yes, absolutely. The question is not just who, but how many. When did they? I guess it'd be multiple questions. Who? like by name, these 10 people meet this definition, and these 10 people know or knew, or better yet, here's my favorite, reasonably should have known. It's the ostrich rule. You can't bury your head in the sand while the room's on fire and say, I didn't know it was on fire, so I didn't call the fire department.
Well,
right?
in
Like, you can't
Scientology's case, the number of people who fit the first category are so large that the second category almost becomes irrelevant. And, you know, that's why the title of this video is Scientology's Massive Legal Liability. The very system that is Scientology makes it a certainty that when wrongdoing like this comes up, Scientology knows all about it. They investigate these things thoroughly. It's just all done internally. And the number of people who become aware of this, just given the structure of Scientology, auditors, case supervisors, ethics officers, directors of processing, director of inspections and reports, the director of the Office of Special Affairs, people who have no ministerial protections whatsoever. So many people become aware of these things. This is what I mean when I title this video Scientology's Massive Legal Liability, because I'm going to continue to expose anytime I hear of children who've been abused. And I've gotten so many emails, it's not even funny.
Oh, absolutely. You know, the classic example I give for that. So I do a lot of work in the audio visual world. You wouldn't know because I'm not in my studio right now, so I have a garbage camera, but that's not the point. And I've worked at churches. I had a supervisor at a church who was their director of tech worship. He was not a clergy. He was not a pastor. He in no way met the criteria for pastor. If I told him my super life secrets, he couldn't hold those in the pastoral privilege. He is a mandated reporter because he works at a full-time capacity with a religious institution. So if I made an allegation, he has an obligation to report that.
Amazing. So perhaps, and you might remember this at the end of the email, perhaps the main point this viewer was making is this is not some big linchpin that the authorities are going to be able to take down Scientology because of. I think one of the points she made is even in instances where crime is uncovered, they never go after the people who should have reported. Does the archdiocese situation tend to contradict that?
Not necessarily, because none of the individuals, the archbishop, the vicar general, any of the support staff who reported to the archbishop and the vicar general, none of those individuals were ever personally found legally responsible in any capacity, civilly or criminally. The archdiocese paid out an enormous sum of money because had it gone to jury, they'd have been hit with a Alex Jones type verdict.
So they settled. They weren't found liable per se. They settled.
Right. And they settled, and that's super common. That stuff like that settles.
I got it.
You know, and we see that, you know, even in the Danny Masterson, like paying hush money.
Right. Okay. So I perhaps may have been conflating seeing an organization pay out massive sums in a civil settlement. I might have been conflating that with them being found liable for violating mandatory reporting laws. When what looked like was happening was not really what was happening. And so I guess I would be totally fine with Scientology being on the hook for settling for hundreds of millions of dollars for not protecting children, regardless of whether it's actually a violation of mandated reporting laws or not.
Exactly, because it's going to come down to a couple of things. One, those settlement agreements are confidential, so they can only be revealed by court order, and you have to make a showing. Judge, this particular document is relevant. For example, I had a case in which I had settled out a party, and then after the jury came back with a favorable verdict, the question became which party pays how much and is it reduced by law? So I had to go and get a court order allowing me to introduce this confidential settlement agreement into the court record, because that was a document that was going to govern. Otherwise, I can't just market it to everybody. It will also contain clauses like we, the archdiocese, or we, the church, or we, the religious technologies, or we, the whoever, admit or accept no liability. But it's in everybody's best interest to pay these sums of money. That's what I have to say as a lawyer. The legal effect of this is what I will also say. Read into that what you want.
Right. So let me ask you this, though, maybe even particularly about the archdiocese situation that you're talking about. Was that settlement the result of like a class action civil lawsuit?
It
Not
was. It was.
not even
Yeah.
criminal, nothing criminal though?
So I think some. I can't remember specifically if there were any priests who were criminally convicted. I think for some reason the name. I know the guy. I don't know him, but I know of the guy, Father Jerome Kern. I'm thinking he pled guilty to something, but I can't conclusively say that. I'd have to go back and look. But in the archdiocese situation, it was a class action. They sort of like the Danny Mass, Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 2, Jane Doe 3, but they were all minors. Most of the minors were actually boys, were male children. There may have been a few females, but we also know that there is, I think it's in Italy, there is an order of what they call women religious, so like nuns, for example, who have been had acts committed against them by the priests who serve that particular community of women religious. And so it can happen all ages, all
Right.
genders, all sexual orientations. There is no perfect victim. There is no uh, there is no imperfect victim. You're either a victim or you're not. The act is either committed or it's not. So
Right. Because from where I'm sitting, Scientology is in the exact same situation as these religious organizations like the one in Minnesota, everything that happened in Boston. They have these children under their care. They become aware of abuse. They don't report it. They rehabilitate the abusers and send them somewhere else. And I see no difference between
there's
that
not.
happening in Scientology and what's happened in some of these Catholic archdioceses.
Yeah, there's absolutely there's no difference. The only the in the way the acts are committed. We know there's cover-ups. We know there's attempted rehabilitations. We know that they're moving these offenders and wrongdoers to other the Catholic Church would call them other parishes or other assignments. I call them other opportunities to reoffend. Because instead of turning this person in and doing what they're supposed to do under law, they just keep shopping them and hiding them and kicking it under the rug. There's absolutely no difference. Now, the Catholic Church did put together the Council for the Safety of Young Persons or something. I forget exactly what the name of it was, and it was headed by a bunch of Catholic bishops and a couple of cardinals and stuff. And it's all based in the United States. The Pope, both Benedict and Francis, were involved in creating church policy, doing formal apologies and working out restitution opportunities for some of these victims. But ultimately, the problem will continue to perpetuate if you don't do what you're supposed to do and report these people who are alleged to have done these awful things. I don't care how many words you say or how many letters you write or how many policies you dictate. They're going to continue to reoffend if you give them opportunities to reoffend.
Right. It's interesting. This isn't the subject of this video, but so Scientology justifies this. There's ways they justify organizationally to protect the organization, but to a true believer, they would say only Scientology can actually fix the reason these people do these things, and that's why sending them to prison instead of just giving them more Scientology is the wrong solution. But Christians or Catholics, I know Catholics are Christian. People always want to correct me on that, except non-Catholics who are Christian would never want to be lumped in as a Catholic. So apologies for differentiating. There's no similar excuse in the world of Christianity, right? Do they believe, I know you accept Jesus as your savior and you go to heaven, but they don't believe that once you accept Jesus as your savior, you're no longer a sinner. They believe everyone's always a sinner. So is there any similar justification used in the Christian world for not reporting someone to the authorities, or is it purely reputational, trying to protect the organization from reputational damage?
It's going to be, in my opinion, and I am not a biblical scholar for all of the knowledge I possess. My wife's knowledge of the Bible is much better. She grew up in a church where Sunday school was a much more significant part of the curriculum than the church I grew up in. But it's going to be the latter. It's going to be purely symbolic. It's going to be reputation, the management of reputation. Making sure that people are coming in the doors, people are continuing to tithe and give and do those things because. And I'm a person of faith. I'm a churchgoer. I'm a believer. I'm a person of faith. But what I will also tell you is, My church operates the same way as the Religious Technology Center. My church relies on donations from its members to operate.
Confession absolves sins, but it doesn't guarantee that you won't reoffend, right?
That's
Like
correct.
Christians don't believe that you're no longer a sinner. You've just been absolved of
the sins to which you've confessed and of which the priest has absolved you. So you go into confession, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been however long since my last confession. You then confess your sins. So in the Catholic Church, there's mortal sins and then there's minor sins. But go ahead.
Well, does the fact of having your sin absolved sort of remove the whole, well, therefore you should be punished by the legal system? Is that, would that sort of be how it's justified or no? Okay.
No. So the absolution of sins. So first off, this is where the various denominations of Christianity. So you've got Catholic of 1.4, 1.5 billion Catholics around the world, and a bunch of different rites, rites within the Latin rite, the Eastern rite, and the Orthodox rite. And then you have the Protestant movement, which is everybody who's not a Catholic, which includes Eastern Orthodox. But this is where the various dogmas and doctrines sort of vary. So the absolution of sin in the Catholic Church is things like that's God's grace forgiving you of your sins, but that means you have been forgiven of your sins in the eyes of God, not in the eyes of the law.
Interesting. And so, do Christians, if you have the eyes of God and the eyes of the law, or the laws of God and the laws of man, if we were to talk about the Scientology perspective or not, they would consider only Scientology's laws matter and WOG law doesn't matter.
Right.
Do Christians view it as God's law matters and man's law matters?
So that's going to depend on the particular faith. We may have to find you an expert on religious differences. There's some really good,
because I think
there are some really
if
good
you
ones
see the documentaries on like fundamentalist, JWs and Mormons, they don't care about man's law.
Yeah, and so it depends specifically on the denomination, but those particular denominations who recognize the coexistence of these two laws refer to the biblical provision that says, pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? You don't have to like tax, but God says in the Bible, or at least the Bible says, depending on whether you believe it's the actual word of God, or it is people who are summarizing their understanding 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, depending on how you believe the Bible, because even the Bible is viewed differently amongst denominations. Essentially, pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? God will forgive you of your sins, but you still exist in an earthly world that has rules, and we have to play by those rules. Now, some denominations view those differently. Some denominations say if the rule of man violates, or if the law of man violates the law of God, you have an obligation to follow the law of God, even to the point of incarceration in the law of man. And this is the very I'm not getting into the politics of it. This is part of the basis of the Roe versus Wade and the overturn of Roe. That's why it was such a big deal.
Interesting. So I don't think the law will care about whether Scientology has a better excuse for not reporting its offenders than Christian groups do. But I wondered if Christianity had that same very specific rationale for why reporting would be detrimental spiritually, not just reputationally. L. Ron Hubbard created a great little system to justify never reporting anything to the authorities.
Yeah. So ultimately the answer to that is there are some particular Christian denominations who do believe that, and there are some who don't. It's going to depend specifically on the system or the denomination of the Christian faith that an individual worships in.
Very interesting. Well, this has been awesome. We covered a lot of ground here, and I'll probably definitely just change the way I talk about some of this stuff. But it seems like the focus is still a correct thing. Focusing on this particular issue still seems to be a correct target, and trying to hold Scientology accountable for protecting the children, working for it, is still something I think that the authorities will be interested in, that subject.
Absolutely. I
yeah.
think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, I hope I addressed all the super chats. I think I did. And thanks for watching with us tonight. And we'll talk to you soon. Have a great night.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, oh, then you could click right